Hey guys, welcome back to Gideon Stuff and welcome to another Gideon Stuff adventure. I'm kind of trying to change up the format for these videos. Instead of for the past couple of videos, what I've done is I've sat and I've talked about the geology, history, etc., of an area, and then we've gone and done the adventure. I want to kind of try and do things a little more kind of spliced in back and forth, which I did with some of the earlier videos, but anyways, we're going to try to do that moving forward. Today, I am in eastern New Mexico. I'm at Blackwater Draw, which is a really, really awesome place. Kind of one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. Very, very important. Really cool stuff here, and I am just super excited to talk about it. So right now I'm going to run in and pay my $3 fee, and then we will go ahead and hit the trail. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Unlike a lot of my adventure videos, we're not going to be hiking miles and miles and miles out into the backcountry, climbing out or anything like that. This is a very well-kept National Historic Landmark. There's a nice little trail here. It's, I don't know, what is the loop? Like, I'm not even sure what it is. Probably just over a mile or so. So we're not going to be taking many tools with me or anything. But I do want to set a little bit of context. We're out here at Blackwater Draw, about 6 miles north of the town of Port Dallas, New Mexico, and about 11 miles south of Clovis. Clovis is pretty important. It gave the name to the Clovis people. We'll be talking about that more later. As far as a geologic overview, of course, today we're going to be talking mostly about archaeology and geomorphology. I want to talk a lot about soil horizons and stuff like that, but I do want to kind of establish a little bit of a geologic context because I am a geologist. That's my wheelhouse. So we're out here on the Llano Estacado in eastern New Mexico. Very flat area. In fact, right here, you see we've got like a little bowl. It's about as much canyon and stuff as you get out here. But the Llano Estacado is basically this very thick deposition of caliche, which is a calcium carbonate clay, essentially. And it's sitting on top of the Ogallala Formation. We'll talk about stuff like that later. But basically, we have this huge, thick crust of calcium carbonate that stretches out over these plains. Right now, we're in what's called the Portales Valley, which is a little bit of a low point. And 13,000 years ago, this little area right here would have been a lake fed by a natural spring, and that attracted tons and tons of megafauna, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today. So let's talk a little bit about New Mexico 13,000 years ago. We talked a little bit about archaeology of the Southwest and New Mexico in particular when I made my video on Sandia Man and the Sandia Cave, but that was a little bit of a different theme. We're going into fraud. It has been proposed for a long time that some of the earliest ancestors of the modern indigenous peoples of the Americas came to the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge. And again, in the Sandia Man Cave video, we talked a lot about other hypotheses. The White Sands tracks make it very likely that humans have been here for even longer than we previously thought. But we do know for certain that people were well established in New Mexico 13,000 years ago with the emergence of the Clovis culture. Hey guys, it's Gideon from a few weeks later. We're going to talk about the geology of the Llano Estacado here in just a second. When I was recording out at Blackwater Draw on that particular day, I was exhausted. My sister was graduating from ENMU, and I probably got like 6 hours of sleep over the course of 48 hours there for that weekend. I was traveling and then celebrations and stuff like that. It was rough. I was going to cut out all of my ramblings, but I decided to leave them in because they're kind of funny. Yeah, you guys are going to have to put up with me rambling about camels and my personal struggles with science communication and things like that. It's a little bit incoherent, but I think it's kind of funny, so we're going to leave it in. But for right now, let's go ahead and talk about the geology of the Llano Estacado. And to do that, we're going to use my handy New Mexico State Geologic Map that I finally got hung up after months and months. It's a big map. It's hard to hang up. Eastern New Mexico has a reputation for being a little bit boring. And it kind of is. Like, I'm not going to lie. It kind of is. I lived out there for a long time when I was a kid. I found a lot of things to do, but it is kind of boring. It's very flat. You look out for miles and miles. There's this old joke that I used to hear people say, you could watch your dog run away for 3 days. That's how flat it was. Rolling grass, you got dairy farms, and you've got wind turbines all over the place. But the Llano Estacado is a very important feature in the area, and it's honestly a pretty important feature of the Southwest in general, and it's definitely worth talking about. The name Llano Estacado is Spanish for staked plains. Llano is obviously plains, Estacado, staked, and legend has it that they were given this name originally by Spanish conquistadors who said that the eastern edge of the Llano Estacado reminded them of the battlements or the stockades of some humongous fort. I don't know how true that is, but I can definitely see that as being a likely etymology for this area. If you look at my handy-dandy map here, the Llano Estacado is basically from here, and then over to the border. A large chunk of it also sits in Texas. And I think we're going to go ahead and get a little bit closer to the map so you guys can see some of this stuff a little bit better. All right, how do I want to do this? We are learning together, guys. We are learning together. Maybe I should walk out there and point at stuff. Ooh, should I use the laser pointer? Yeah, we're going to use the laser pointer. All right, here we go. So the state of New Mexico is pretty complex geologically. There's a lot going on here. But we can divide the state into a couple of different physiographic provinces, different areas that are characterized by specific tectonic events or similar geology or geography, things like that. So typically, if we look over here in the northwestern corner of the state, this is the Colorado Plateau. You can kind of see it, like right here is kind of the shape of the Colorado Plateau. Here on the south is kind of bordered by the Mogollon Daddle volcanic field. Up here on its eastern edge is the Sierra Nacimiento, which is a big fault system. Up here is San Juan Basin. Very, very important area. Down here we have the Basin and Range province. All of these pink and purple and yellow rocks in here are going to be tertiary volcanic rocks. We'll talk about that here in a second. Right here, kind of through the middle of the state, is the Rio Grande Rift. It's bounded on either side by large mountain chains, like right here, for example, is the San Andres Mountains that lead up into the Manzano, Manzanita, and then finally to the Sandias. Up here we have the Rocky Mountains. So these are going to be the Southern Rockies. They kind of straddle the Rio Grande Rift on this side. Up here between the Colorado Plateau and the Rio Grande Rift, we have the Tusis Mountains. Over here we have the Sangre de Cristos. And then if we get over to this side of the state, we have the High Plains. And that's what we're going to want to focus on today. Okay, you might be confused. Why did I go through the trouble of introducing everything else in the state when we're just going to be focused on this area in here? Well, because this is geology and everything connects. And so right now, before we start connecting all those dots, I want to give you guys a little bit of context to help you look at this map and interpret it and kind of put things together for yourself. All the different colors that you see on this map represent different ages of rocks. In the United States, we have a very strict color coding system for labeling rock units. So just looking out here, we see this big splotch of blue here. Blue is typically Paleozoic rocks. A lot of the stuff in here is Pennsylvanian and Permian, although the Triassic and Jurassic are also kind of bluish. you can see right in here, these are Triassic rocks, and they're kind of a bluish green. Green rocks up here, these are going to be Cretaceous rocks. Over here, where we're going to be focusing on, we see some kind of pale oranges and yellows. Those are going to represent very young or more modern alluvium and other sedimentary rocks. Over here, we've got these pinks and these purples and some yellows and stuff. This is going to be younger Cenozoic volcanic rocks and such. And then in a couple of places, particularly up here in the Rockies, these dark gray and brown and kind of maroon colors, those are going to be Proterozoic rocks. These are going to be some of the oldest rocks in New Mexico. You can see them cropping out here in the Sangre de Cristos, up in the Tuxas Mountains, a little bit out here in the Sierra Ladrones and other places. But all of these rocks are connected in an erosion cycle, in the sedimentary rock cycle. All right, let's get a little bit closer. When we look at this map, we can also see that every single rock unit also has a label. These labels are typically 2 to 4 letters long, and they tell you the age and the name and the rock type of your colored area. So in this case here, we have a TO, and we'll talk about this here in a second. T stands for tertiary. That's going to be the first letter. It's always capitalized, and this tells you the age. Now, tertiary is not a term that we like to use very much in the literature these days for a multitude of reasons that we're not going to get into, but it was used extensively in the past, and so it has become a useful tool for map making and labeling. Now, if we go over here, we can see like this PSA. In this case, P stands for Permian. This is the Permian Basin. Let me see if I can find a Pennsylvanian P, because they look a little bit goofy. There we go. There we go. Let's go ahead and drop down here. And you can actually see right here in the Sacramento Mountains, that little P that's got like an extra line on him. That's for Pennsylvanian rocks. And then actually, since we're talking about T for tertiary, if I come up here to some Triassic rocks, you can see that the Triassic symbol is like a T and an R kind of combined into one. All right, so let's get back over here to the Llano Estacado. What we see here is Blackwater draw is going to be in this area right here. We've got 2 formations that are going to be really, really important that I want to talk about. One of them is our TO right here. This is the Ogallala Formation. The other is this QOA. Q stands for quaternary, and this OA is going to be older alluvium. This is basically a sequence of eroded rocks and caliche that has stacked up on top of the Ogallala Formation. Out through here in the Portales Valley, we also have this QE, which is going to be quaternary Aeolian sediments. This is going to be windblown sands. And this area, we're going to come back and talk about this here in a second. But this Ogallala Formation is a very, very important geologic formation and deserves some more explanation. The Llano Estacado is actually a huge mesa, which is a large uplifted area of land that has a very flat top. And in fact, the Llano Estacado is one of the largest mesas in North America. So if we're looking out here, you see this little ridge right here? This is going to be our western border of the Llano Estacado. And if you're driving from Roswell to Clovis along 70 or something like that, you're going to see that ridge. You're going to cross up over it. In fact, actually a better example is if you're driving along 380 out of Roswell. Right about here, you're going to cross the Pecos River. You're going to go up into the Llano Estacado, and it's a fairly dramatic rise up on top of this little cliff face. You can see here we have this big valley, and here that's going to be the Pecos River Valley. There's a bunch of different rivers that flow around this area. We're going to be talking about a bunch of them. But the geology of the Llano Estacado is composed primarily of the Ogallala Formation. The Ogallala Formation is sitting on top of Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks in this area. You can see here we have all these Permian Basin rocks. These are all going to be passive margin ocean sediments for the most part, a bunch of limestones. And we can see that as we go this way, we've got this big ridge right here. And this is not a topographic map, right? There's no topography being mapped here, but if you look at enough of these maps, you can kind of see when things start to kind of change and happen. So yeah, right here is going to be our shelf for the escarpment. We can see out through the Llano Estacado, there's a couple of spots where we've eroded down to those Paleozoic rocks again. Out here is some Triassic rocks, mainly Chinle group, I believe. So all of the Ogallala Formation, the rocks that make up the Llano Estacado, are sitting on top of much, much older Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks. There's actually even a spot right here where there's just a little blurb of Cretaceous rocks peeking out, which is kind of cool. And I don't think I've ever been over there, so I should probably go over there one of these days and check that out. The Ogallala Formation is a series of sands and gravels that accumulated between the end of the Miocene and the early Pliocene, between about 10 and 5 million years ago. It's named after a town in Nebraska, I believe, Ogallala, Nebraska, and it is prolific. It's a very widespread formation. It's also a very, very important one because it is a massive water reservoir. In fact, the Ogallala Formation houses several important aquifers for millions of people in the United States, from New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, the Dakotas, Wyoming. This formation holds a lot of water. I need to make a video one of these days about aquifers. I thought about doing it in this video, but this is already going to be long enough, I think. I will say this, most people's impressions of an aquifer are wrong. A lot of people think it's like a giant cave underground that has a huge lake in it that we just, basically stick a straw in and suck the water out. That's not really the case. Aquifers are not underground lakes. They're more like water that's trapped in sediments. So in the case of the Ogallala Formation, I mentioned we have a lot of gravels and sands. The water can get in between the spaces between these gravel and sand particles and get stuck there, and it just sits there. And so we can, find where that water is, drill down to it, and extract it from the rock. It also has to do with porosity and permeability. I want to talk about that so bad, but we're going to save it for a different video. Now, the way the Ogallala Formation formed is why I want to give a geologic overview of the entire state. The Ogallala Formation is made up of little bits and pieces eroded from the Rocky Mountains. If we go back in time about 75 million years to the Cretaceous, the drainage basins in North America were a lot different than they are today. In fact, North America was split into two different land masses by a shallow ocean that we call the Western Interior Seaway. Well, then about 75 million years ago, the Laramide orogeny kicked off. And we've talked about the Laramide orogeny several times on the channel before, but long story short, a tectonic plate called the Farallon Plate started to coast underneath North America and push the continent up. As that land was being pushed up, the ocean started to retreat, right? You push the land up and the water is going to slide off of it. This is what's building the Rocky Mountains. Well, this whole process lasts until about 45 million years ago. And then boom, we have the Rocky Mountains built. But on the east side of the Rockies was an area that at one point used to be underneath this huge Western Interior Seaway, but was now just a really big kind of flat area that had been popped up above the ocean. We didn't really build a whole lot of mountains out there. The deformation was not that intense past the Rockies, but we had uplifted the continent enough that there was no more ocean basins. And today, we can still see that. We call it the High Plains. It takes up about the eastern fifth of New Mexico. This period between 75 and 45 million years ago was really chaotic in New Mexico. There's a lot going on. But one of the things that happened at this time was the Continental Divide was developed. And the way that rivers ran into the ocean from the continents changed drastically. That tends to happen when you just, build mountains in places where there didn't used to be mountains. So on the east side of the Rockies, not just in New Mexico, across this area of the United States, rivers were taking
sediment down to these big flat plains and then just dumping them. There wasn't really enough energy to move a whole lot of the sediment all the way out to the ocean. A lot of the sediment wasn't making it into river, big river systems like the Mississippi River and being drained into the ocean. Instead, a lot of this gravel and sand was just being dumped in this flat area. And eventually, over time, that stacked up, and that's what became the Ogallala Formation as we know it today. Now, one of the characteristic features of the Llano Estacado is actually the uppermost layer of the Ogallala Formation. It's a thick layer of caliche. It's kind of a cap rock. Caliche is an accumulation of calcium carbonate. We're not cutting that out. You guys know I can't speak English. And it sits on top of the sandstones and gravels in this area. Remember our map here? This is Ogallala Formation, and this yellow QOA is our older alluvium stuff. This is things that get eroded off the top of the Ogallala Formation, and it includes that thick cap of caliche. This layer of caliche can be up to 6 feet thick in some places, and it is an absolute pain to try and dig through. Ask anyone who lives in this area, post hole diggers, people that put in telephone poles, farmers, ask them, how easy is it to dig a hole out there? Pretty easy until you hit the caliche. When you hit the caliche, you're pretty much done, unless you have a damn good auger. It's a very, very thick and very resistant material, which helps to give the characteristic shape to the Llano Estacado. It gives, kind of holds everything in place as capstones tend to do. Old-time geologists who first started exploring this area and the American West in general used to call caliche algal limestone because they thought that the caliche was formed from algae organisms that were living in lakes. One of the major forms that calcium carbonate can take is as limestone, as we see right here, being deposited from the exoskeletons of corals and other critters living in coral reefs. But that's really not how we get caliche. Caliche is a product of soil reduction. If you have an area that has very little precipitation, but a high rate of evaporation, you'll get a lot of caliche. Basically what happens is water in the system will pick up calcium carbonate, which is water soluble, and so you'll have this mineral-rich water sitting in the soil. Well, along comes the sun, the water evaporates, and it leaves behind that calcium carbonate, and it starts to collect into these big clumps and nodules, and over time, it just accumulates into a big, huge mass. I think this is a great time to talk about soil horizons because I want to talk about soil horizons. What is soil? You might think you know, but I bet you probably don't. The USDA defines soil as such: the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. And I think that's a decent definition, especially if you're worried about agriculture, growing food, and things like this. I think that works. But soil can be a little more specific. Sometimes people use the term earth interchangeably with soil, or dirt sometimes. But soil is pretty complex. Let me explain. One difference that I was taught between soil and dirt in the course of my education is that soil contains organic material. Dirt can be just kind of loose particles with not as much organic concentration as in soil. So a lot of times, myself included, people will just use soil and dirt interchangeably, but that doesn't really tell the entire story. And even then, soil can get more complex. Let's go ahead and talk about the different soil horizons. Most soil has 3 horizons: A, B, and C, and then you can add in other layers depending on what you're trying to do, such as an O layer on the very top. And the O layer is going to be very organic material dense. This is going to be like decomposing leaves and mulch and things like that. And it sits on top of our layer A. I think I said mulch when I was talking about the O horizon. I think that the term that soil scientists use is humus. Regardless, let's go on to horizon A. Horizon A is what we call topsoil. It's on top. I think you can tell why it got that name. And this is going to be a mix of minerals eroded from the parent rocks, as well as organic material from organisms, obviously. This is a layer that is really, really good for growing food in. So this is probably what that USDA definition was mostly referring to as soil. Next is going to be our B horizon. This is the subsoil, and this is where leached materials go. These are going to be particularly mineral elements that kind of fall down from the top layer. They get dragged down by water or other processes and accumulate here at this B level. There's not a whole lot of organic material here. This is mostly mineral. And then our final horizon is the C horizon. This is the parent material horizon. This is where the constituents for the other horizons originally come from. And this can be other soils, this can be bedrock. It just depends on your environment and what's being sourced to create your soil. Now, there are two other soil horizons I kind of skipped over that we can talk about. Again, these are some of the ones that are missing from certain areas. Most soils, pretty much all soils, have the A, B, C. Some of them you can throw in the O horizon, the organic horizon, the humus. I think soils that have a very thick O layer are called histosols. Really, really trying to plumb the depths of my environmental science courses. Regardless, the other two layers are the E and the R horizons. The E horizon, or the alluviated horizon, sits between the A and the B, and it's an area that gets leached of almost everything. Clay, organic material, most minerals, and of course those fall down to the B horizon underneath, the subsoil that collects all those yummy minerals and stuff. And what you're left with in the E horizon is essentially just sand, quartz and other resistant minerals, and not much nutrients there. And then our final horizon is the R, which is bedrock. If your bedrock is being eroded, that can maybe be your C tier where you're getting your parent material from. This is not part of the soil. It can be what the soil is sitting on. Gosh damn, my nipple is really hard. I need to turn down the AC. This is the bedrock. It's completely removed from the rest of the soil except as a source for material. Now that B horizon, that subsoil, that's important for the Llano Estacado because that's where we're going to be developing a lot of this caliche that would later, become the cap rock of the area. The Llano Estacado is very arid. It does not get much precipitation. It has very hot summers, and so what precipitation it does get, more often than not, gets evaporated. So you have water moving through your soils for a little while, and it's picking up water-soluble elements such as your calcium carbonate, and then it gets evaporated. And when the water evaporates away, it leaves that calcium carbonate behind, starts forming these little nodules of calcium carbonate in your B horizon, and then eventually it just coalesces into a huge monstrosity that becomes caliche. Now, I had a thought about the formation of the caliche on top of the Ogallala formation here on the Llano Estacado as I was driving back home from there, and I didn't find any literature addressing this specifically. Maybe I should look a little bit harder and come up with something. And actually, I also don't know exactly how old the caliche in the Llano Estacado is. Like, it's obviously being added to, continually. But I don't actually know the age of the, maximum nucleation for this caliche. Maybe I should look that up before I say what I'm about to say. I'm going to say it anyways, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if this caliche is around the same age as a Blackwater draw site, which would be 13,000 years or so, That would put the age of the Caliche in the middle of the Younger Dryas period, which was a time of very rapid cooling on the planet. And we'll talk about the Younger Dryas and stuff later on in the video. But very rapid cooling can lead to an increase in precipitation. And then the Younger Dryas period was followed by very sudden warming, which leads to an increase in evaporation. So if you have an increase in precipitation, that means you have more water flowing through your soils, picking up more dissolved calcium carbonate. And then if you suddenly evaporate that, boom, you have a ton of caliche suddenly being deposited. That sounds really good to me. There might be some problems with that. I should actually probably look. I might not include this clip in the video. I'm going to do some more research on that in particular and see what I come up with. Okay, so because I'm ADHD, I couldn't just continue with the rest of the video without researching my little idea right there. And I'm not finding a whole lot of... I found this publication from the NMGS about aggregate resources in central eastern New Mexico. And it talks a little bit about caliche ages. When was this published? 1972. Okay. But basically, I've come up with radiocarbon dating of these caliche deposits on the Llano Estacado, ranging from 11,250 to 31,700 years ago. However, this is a dating of the carbon itself in the calcium carbonate, and not necessarily the time of deposition. So with those younger ages of 11,250, that does align more or less with the end of the Younger Dryas. Which could... Yeah, Younger Dryas was 12,900 to 11,700, give or take. So maybe, the warming could have started a little bit earlier in places like the Llano Estacado, which would have been, a little more south. Not quite equatorial, but, decently close compared to further north. I don't know. I'll actually have to keep looking into this. This could be the rabbit hole that I crawl down for the next couple of weeks. All right, so here's something very interesting. This slope here, you can see these thick white beds. That's that caliche layer that we're talking about. But this little plaque here talks about slope stabilization and how this little hill right here was preserved by archaeologists so that they could continue studying the stratigraphy and getting more information about the human occupation of this area. One of the most important things when it comes to archaeology or geology, paleontology, a lot of these different sciences is context. We talked about this a lot in the Sandia Man Cave video, but without context, artifacts are next to useless. And so being able to preserve the stratigraphy, the ordering of soil, tells you a lot about the artifacts you're able to pull out of that soil. And it talks here about how a lot of research has gone on with this little bluff that's been preserved and has been providing further evidence of human occupation at the site, which is pretty cool. Fun little fact, when I was a youngster for a time, my family lived over here near Portales. And this is a very interesting part of the state, to say the least, but I could not live here now. I need my mountains. I'm glad they have Blackwater draw though. This is a very interesting thing. Here we go. Okay, awesome. This is a better look at that bluff that we were just talking about. Let's go ahead and turn this around. There we go. We can really see the stratigraphy through there really beautifully. That was actually what I was wondering at the last signpost. Like, I wish I could get back in there and around. I have not been to Blackwater draw in several years, but this is exactly what I wanted to see. All right, so yeah, really cool. So like I already said, this was a prehistoric lake at one point. And so when we're looking at the stratigraphy of these soil layers, we can see evidence of that lake. Here it's talking about the Brazos River, which nowadays has the headwaters
in Texas, but in prehistoric times, the headwaters were around this area, which is really, really cool. And this little trail that we're going to be walking on is going to follow roughly the boundaries of that lake. Very cool. Blackwater Draw was discovered by a teenage rancher named James Whiteman in 1929. He found elephant bones and arrowheads, and he reported this find to the Smithsonian. And several years later, they sent out an archaeologist who immediately recognized that they had something special on their hands here. And so excavations began. And as part of these excavations, archaeologists realized that they had discovered a major tool-making civilization that existed in North America that they called the Clovis people, named, of course, for Clovis, New Mexico, which is very close by. Now, the Clovis culture existed all across North America and into South America. This is not just a local people. This was a culture that crossed continents. Now, when I did my video on Sandia Cave, and we talked about Sandia Man and everything, we talked a little bit about the peopling of the Americas. We talked a little bit about the archaeology of New Mexico as a whole. We talked about the White Sands tracts and how it's very likely people have been in the Americas for much longer than has been traditionally thought. But we can put all that aside for now. What we do know is that 13,000 years ago, people were in New Mexico, and they were making a very sophisticated type of projectile point. All right, so this is really cool. I am standing where history was made, okay? So right here, thank you to this sign, right here, a partial mammoth skeleton was discovered and excavated in 1932, and 2 spearheads were found with that mammoth. And this was the first time archaeologists had ever recognized a mammoth kill site, or at least a mammoth kill site associated with humans. And those 2 spear points, shown right here, became the type specimens for the Clovis culture, which is really, really interesting. You can read a little bit of that there. Yeah, man, that's so important. And again, like all my adventure videos, even though I'm doing a little bit of rambling right now as we walk around, I will hopefully be including snippets of more researched and put together thoughts between these different clips. Now, this right here is what I am very, very excited about. I love this little area in here. When I was a kid, we come and visit, I would stay in this building for hours. And you're about to see why. They built this building over a bone bed excavation site. So you can see here, this is the hill, and the archaeologists were digging in to the hillside and uncovering all these remains. There's a jar right there, looks like a camel. Let's see if they have anything. Diatomaceous earth. Yeah. Oh, this is so cool. I could stay in here for hours. Up here we have really cool Bison antiquus, one of the primary food sources for paleo-indigenous peoples. Wow, spear point found between 2 ribs of mammoth 4. Very, very cool. Mammoth humerus, mammoth rib, juvenile bison. Sweet. This is a very, very cool exhibit, and we've got a lot of stuff on the walls that you can read about. Looks like we got some stuff being prepared over there, which is really, really sweet. Now, again, I am not an archaeologist, so some of the, I don't know, I don't have the vocabulary to talk about this as an archaeologist would, but they do a very, very good job with all the signs here. And I do want to talk about their stratigraphy here real quick. So let's go back down here and do that. Stratigraphy is the key in keeping the context for any kind of archaeological or geologic survey, exploration, things like that. And it all has to do with the law of superposition. Basically, what this means is that as soils are deposited, the oldest ones are going to be deposited first, the younger ones on top of that, and the younger ones on top of that. And so if you're digging down into a hillside like we have right here, you'll start with your youngest stuff on top, and you'll go down to your older stuff. So we see here that we start at stratum B and C, and we go all the way up to G, I think is the highest one they have labeled here. So that would mean that G is our youngest stratum, and B is our oldest stratum. And we can see that there's a lot going on here. Without the labels, you could still probably be able to tell with just a naked eye that there is some differences between these different levels in the hillside. Number one, right here we have a huge bone bed. Look at all these bones in here. It's kind of in this grayish, kind of almost rocky looking sediment. And then we have a kind of, I don't know, that looks like a sculptor's clay color to me. We've got a little bit of gray, and we've got differences in texture changes. So even a layperson can look at this and see that we are changing. There are distinct differences, and that each of these layers probably represents a different depositional environment, which in fact they do. So right here's a helpful little chart talking about the stratigraphy of the site, of course, oldest to youngest. Level A is not exposed in this particular pit here, but we do have, they have this labeled as B, C. Oh, actually, Springstown, we do have A. Okay, so the very bottom is A. So we do have A exposed at the very, very bottom. That's going to be our sand caliche. Okay. And then our B, C, I'm guessing the horizon's not that well separated right here, which is why they have them kind of labeled as the same thing. But very, very helpful little chart here. We're going to see how the environment that these soils are being deposited in changes over time. Our oldest stuff, about 17,000 years. BP means before present. So we're going to go from our modern, here Spanish. And this is something that's really, really cool to me about soil horizons and archaeology is you can get very, very precise with a lot of your dates. A lot of stuff that I work with as a geologist is quite a bit older. The lines are a little more blurred between different distinctions of periods. And sometimes we have to be, a little bit generous with where we divide out our different time zones. But you can see here, we've got, the Spanish right here, that's stuff that was deposited during Spanish exploration. And we have modern stuff. Gives a really, really good idea for how all these different layers relate to each other. So anyways, in our lowest stratum, in our B and C here, that's where we find Clovis artifacts, as well as fossils of mammoth, bison, ground sloth, turtles, camels, horses, and direwolves. Very, very cool. Go over here to stratum D, moving up section. This is where we're going to find our Folsom Age stuff. Diatomaceous earth is formed from diatoms, which are little microscopic organisms that live in water. So this right here tells us that these soils are being deposited in a wet environment. This lake that we've been talking about. Stratum E, carbonaceous silt, organic rich sandy silt. From an era, I don't like that they're using the word era there. Era means something very specific when we're talking about geology, the aging earth, things like that, but we can pass on that. I guess we'll zoom in here a little bit. Late Paleo-Indian use, 10,000 years before present. Agate Basin, I believe, is named after an area in Wyoming that preserves sites around this 10,000 year date. What's really cool to me about this is we have different point types. So you have different cultural groups using the site during this period. That's very, very interesting to me to think about Paleo-Indigenous peoples kind of sharing hunting grounds, things like that. This is really cool right here, this post-depositional disturbances plaque. You can see here we've got like a little chunk of something that's a different color in here. That's a burrow. Animals don't care about stratigraphy, right? And you can actually see up here, we have kind of another example of this where we have the roots from this tree growing down through the older layers. When animals burrow through soil, we call this bioturbation. They don't have that labeled right here, but basically what bioturbation does is an animal digs down into the soil and it kind of messes things up. And if your layer is sufficiently bioturbated, you lose a lot of really important data. Sometimes it's not that bad, like right here. Doesn't look like, too bad. I see some more burrows and stuff through there. But sometimes it can really, really mess up everything you thought you knew about an area. Aeolian sediments. So this is being deposited by wind. Right there, we're seeing a change in environment. We're in the same general area, right? We haven't left. I mean, I've been standing in the same place, but we went from water deposition to wind deposition. And that tells me that our lake is starting to shrink, that we're maybe entering a more arid climate. They don't have much data right here on this little sign about what this strata is actually composed of. Maybe we'll have it here. Parallel bands of dark, organic, rich Aeolian sand. Okay, so organic, rich, that we've still got a lot of, fairly wet environment. Marshy sediment. Yeah, kind of maybe not quite a marsh, but definitely maybe a seasonal wetlands. And then G, wind deposited Aeolian tan and reddish brown sand. When we start talking about sand, that to me really screams that we're getting more arid up in stratum G. More recent Aeolian sediments that overlie much of the region. Bone preservation in these upper levels is very poor. Yeah, that would definitely, to me, seem more arid. Periods of wetter climate and some soil development is visible in the darker strata within G. So yeah, I think we are getting more arid, but we're having, occasional wet seasons. We can actually see through here. That's one of those dark areas right there, which might be, has more organic material, indicates a wetter period. Very, very cool. And you can see all these bones in here, just massive, massive boneyard. Sweet. And I think I mentioned when I first walked in here, it looked like we had like a camel jaw back there. Yeah, I did say camels. Camels actually come from North America. And I want to tell a really, really cool, one of my favorite things about camels here in just a second. All right, talking about camels. So camels evolved in North America and then later migrated out of North America, possibly across land bridges back into Asia and into the Middle East and places like that. But where I live, in the Chihuahuan Desert, out around Las Cruces, there's a plant called creosote. And it's all over the desert. I love creosote. It's a really, really cool plant. You find it everywhere. Super prolific. Nothing in the Chihuahuan Desert eats creosote. Nothing. It's toxic. Sometimes rabbits will nibble on it in times of extreme need. Pack rats and kangaroo rats will sometimes use creosote to make their nests. But outside of those very niche uses, nothing touches the creosote. And that's kind of a mystery, right? You would expect plants to evolve defenses against predation, right? Against being eaten on. But you'd also expect that the animals in an environment, some of them at least, might evolve defenses to counter, or I guess counters to those defenses. And so we'd expect that something would eat the creosote, but nothing does. Well, in the 1800s, when America was pushing west, the Army Corps brought a lot of camels from the Middle East. People were trying to move across deserts. Camels have a pretty good track record of being able to survive in deserty environments. That's kind of what they're known for. And so the U.S. Army was testing the efficiency of camels as beasts of burden for pioneers and wagon trains going west. And what they found was that the camels absolutely freaking love creosote. They would eat tons of creosote. In fact, many of the camels would eat nothing but creosote. It made up like 90% of all their diets. The camels were completely immune to the toxins in the creosote. Why? Well, because millions of years ago, even just thousands of years ago, when camels lived in North America, they were the animals that ate the creosote. They kept the environment in check in that way. And then when camels left the Americas and went extinct in North America, when all the North American megafauna died out at the end of the Younger Dryas period, there was nothing left to eat the creosote, and so it was able to kind of explode and take over. I love that. That's something that I tell people about all the time at the museum that I work at. So I just had to share that. All right, so this is really cool. Before this was a National Historic Landmark, people were mining gravel out of the Blackwater Draw area. And in 1962, this guy named Dr. Earl Green found a cache of stone tools out along this wall right here. And that kind of incentivized the ceasing of gravel mining in the area and the protection of the archaeological value of the area. But this cache is really cool because what it is a bundle of tools that ancient people would leave in an area for use when they came back. Paleo-indigenous peoples were more migratory, more nomadic, and so they'd move from place to place, but sometimes they'd leave these tools, weapons, etc. at an area that they knew they'd be coming back to. And that way, when they did get back there, they'd already have tools waiting and ready for them. That's pretty cool, in my opinion. I really, really like that. I spooked some deer. Spooked a couple of deer. My car keys jangling gave them a little bit of a scare. We got another little sign coming up here, so let's see what this has to say. We've got a little metal cutout of a ground sloth, looks like. Within the carbonaceous silt layer. Remember, this is our, what was that, horizon E, I think? Yeah, the carbonaceous silt layer. Interesting. The Portalis complex. That's something that oh, there goes another deer. I also want to stress, and I always try to stress to people when I'm doing any kind of science communication, whether I'm working at the museum or anything, science is about specialization, right? If you want to know about a certain topic, you go to the experts in that field because they are experts in that topic. But they might not be experts in another topic, right? In fact, they probably aren't. And that's one of the big things about science communication in today's day and age that I try to struggle with, is the fact that as science becomes even more and more specialized, it also becomes more complex. And what we're seeing is handfuls of specialists in certain areas who know that topic very, very well, but then it makes it harder to get that knowledge, I guess, distilled down to a more user-friendly format for lay people, I guess. And so, with me in particular, I'm a geologist. I know you want to ask me about, in fact, my research has been in Paleoproterozoic tectonic provinces. You want to ask me about the building of North America 1.8 billion years ago? I got you. You want to ask me everything about Blackwater Draw and the Clovis culture and archaeology? I'm not the guy for that, because this isn't really what I study. But, you know, as a science communicator, I can come and I can read these plaques and I can, you know, do a little bit of research of my own and get myself well enough educated that hopefully I can pass on some useful knowledge to you guys. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing when I get home after this, is reading up on all of this. Well, look, Caliche and the Ogallala Formation. This is what I started out talking about. Ogallala Formation. We were going to discuss it more because it's important to aquifers in the area, but let's go ahead and see what they got to say about it right here. Blackwater Draw used to be the headwaters for the Brazos River. We saw that on an earlier plaque. When the Ogallala Formation was formed in the late Miocene to early Pliocene, rivers flowing east and south eastward cut valleys, causing a change in the direction of stream flow and shifting the current location of the headwaters of the Brazos River. The erosion of the rock now to the west, blah, blah, blah. Yep. calcite to create caliche, covering the Ogallala aquifer. Yeah, it's a very, very important aquifer if you live in any of these areas right here. Yeah. A Gomptothere mandible was discovered. Gomptotheres are a type of elephant relative that had like really crazy tusks. You can see the specimen on display in the visitor center. I did not see that. We might have to go and check on that again. Wow. Very, very cool. Very, very cool. And actually, speaking of elephants, mammoths and mastodons are among the critters found at Blackwater Draw, in particular the Columbian mammoth, which was the biggest mammoth species and also the most common one found in New Mexico. But mammoths and mastodons are actually not as close related to elephants as you might expect. The closest living relative of mammoths, I believe, is an Indian elephant. But mammoths actually genetically separated themselves from elephants about, I don't know, 25, 30 million years ago. And mastodons are even less genetically connected than that, I believe. I may have to double check myself and all that, but I did recently do a lot of reading on the genetic relatedness of different proboscideans. So I've got a little bit of that tucked away in my mind for now, at least. I just recorded a section of video that I immediately deleted because it was so incoherent. It was just babbling. You might be wondering why I'm even down here in eastern New Mexico right now. It's because my sister graduated from Eastern. Go Greyhounds. And came for that. It's been a whirlwind of a weekend. I have not slept very well all week. And I look forward to going back and watching this footage and seeing just how bad it is. Because I do feel like I've been rambling and babbling like a madman, but that's okay. Actually, it probably isn't. But that's for future Gideon to decide. We are back at the visitor center, and I think we're going to go ahead and go to the Blackwater Draw Museum. They're at the Eastern Campus. Just because, get some more info. Alrighty. Here we are at the Blackwater Draw Museum. Got our little receipt from the Site 1. I was first in this museum when it was actually newly under construction, and it's been a while since I've been here, so I'm really excited.
James Ridgely Whiteman was kind of an interesting character in a lot of ways. In 1929, when he discovered Blackwater Draw, he was only 19 years old. This is a picture of him. Holy cow, look at that guy. What a Chad. That picture goes so freaking hard. He was an avid enthusiast of Native American and Paleo-Indian cultures and sites. Before his discovery of Blackwater Draw, he was very closely following discoveries that are being made up around Folsom, New Mexico, in Union County, surrounding the Folsom culture, which was the culture that preceded, or not preceded, my bad. It was a culture that followed the Clovis culture. We'll touch on them just very briefly in this video. But at that time, the Folsom culture was one of the, if not the oldest known cultures in North America. Folsom Point's been discovered near Folsom. The Folsom culture got its name from Folsom, New Mexico. As you can tell, some Folsom Points were discovered in association with a Bison antiquus skeleton, showing, hunting by humans. And Ridgely was following this story, this development, very, very carefully around the time that he made his discovery near Clovis. James Ridgely Whiteman seems like a very interesting character. He was a Boy Scout, as well as an artist. He was actually the first scout in New Mexico to ever get a merit badge for basket weaving. Again, he was really, really interested in Native American culture. He got into making bows and baskets and camping in the ways that the native peoples would. He was one of the first scouts ever at Wahinape Scout Camp out in the Sacramento Mountains. That's kind of cool to me. I did scout camp there 2 years in a row when I was a youngster, so that's pretty nice. Later on in his life, he focused a lot on art. He taught art in a bunch of different places. He did weaving and painting, all kinds of stuff. He started going by the name Osapana Powhatan, I believe. And I'm not sure if he was given this name or if he just kind of assumed it, but he was one of the founders of the Federated Indian Tribe in 1958, which I couldn't find much info on. I tried looking, and I'm sure there's a lot of really, really cool stories there, but I'm not sure how much of this is cultural appropriation, how much of it is actual endeavors to advocate for native peoples. But we're not gonna delve too far into that. So, what is the Clovis culture? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask, what do archaeologists mean when they say culture? And to explore that topic, we might need to ask, what is culture? There's a lot of different ways that culture has been defined over the course of human history. Some people define culture as race. Some people define culture as people who live in a certain area. Culture can be defined by food, clothing, technology. There's a lot of different ways to define culture. But the only right way to define culture is from the inside, not the outside. So when we're talking about modern cultures and we're talking about intercultural relations between people living today, the best place to start in understanding a culture is to ask the people whose culture you want to know about, right? Culture is one of those things that has to be defined by the in-group. You can't be an outside observer putting your own interpretations on top of someone else's culture. That's just disrespectful, and it's wrong, and you're going to miss a lot of things. Culture is complex. It's a mix of traditions, languages, religions. It's a very messy and abstract thing to try and just confine to a good, crisp dictionary definition. And I am not going to attempt to do that right now, right? I'm not even sure I can explain my own culture in a concise manner, and I'm sure as hell not going to try to explain anyone else's. But luckily, when archaeologists are talking about a culture, they're not talking about the personal aspects of it necessarily. Obviously, the only way to understand a culture is to understand the minds and hearts of the people living that culture. That's a little bit outside the scope of archaeology. Instead, when archaeologists refer to a culture, they refer to a group, a society that used similar technology. We have to identify these cultures by the material remains that they left behind, and a lot of times these take the form of tools. We don't know anything about what Clovis culture people would have thought about politics, religion, anything like that. All we can do is look at their material culture. We can look at the tools they used, the items that they made, and we can use this to form a group, right? Even then, the Clovis culture was not one homogeneous society. The Clovis culture spanned the entirety of North America and down, heck, even into South America potentially. We have found Clovis artifacts as far south as Venezuela and as far north as Canada, right? This was obviously not one huge civilization. This would have been a diverse group or a diverse mixture of different people groups, right? They all shared similar technology and tools. This would have been through trade, just from interaction with each other, learning from each other. But these nomadic tribes that spanned an entire continent would have had differences in the way that they saw the world, in the way that they interpreted the world around them. There would have been differences in religion, if they even had it, politics, if they even had it, right? We just don't know any of that, and we can't really speak to any of that right now. So all we can do is what scientists are always doing, and that is organizing. And a lot of the way that scientists sort things into categories is arbitrary. It's just to help us keep track of the data that we're recovering and make it easier to digest and present. Now, while documenting tools and spear points and things is an example of kind of cold, hard, empirical, observational science, the human element of archaeology should not be underestimated. And in fact, there are many archaeologists who focus on answering these kind of tough questions surrounding different cultures and their views on the world. We're not going to get into that right here, and that's a topic that's a little bit hard to tackle when we're speaking about paleo-indigenous cultures, because they didn't have a form of writing that we can tell. They didn't really leave behind any stories or any way for us to piece together whether they had a mythos or not. And so we're going to not touch on that anymore. But it is really important for this discussion to define what archaeologists mean when they say the Clovis culture. This is a way to categorize different sites where we see the same tools being found. So what makes the Clovis culture so important? Well, for a long time, the Clovis culture was generally considered to be the oldest evidence of humans in North America. Now, as we touched on in my Sandia Cave video, other evidence has come forward in the years since, such as the White Sands tracks in southern New Mexico, which push human occupation of the continent back very, very far. We're still, seeing how some of that data shakes out, but it is very likely that humans have been in North America longer than the 13,500 years that was established by this site at Blackwater Draw, locality 1. Blackwater Draw is the type locality for the Clovis culture, meaning that this was the first site where the Clovis culture was recognized as a distinct group. This was the first site where we found artifacts that we could assign to this group. And so that makes it very, very important in the history of understanding the Clovis culture. But it is not the only Clovis site. Clovis sites have been found all over North America. We already mentioned that some of them are as far south as Venezuela. Most of the sites are in the United States, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the Clovis people, where most of them lived. In South America and in the Mexico region, we might have lost a lot of sites. Sea levels are about 50 meters higher today than they were when the Clovis culture was at its peak. So it's very possible that we have lost a lot of beach sites just because they're 50 meters underwater. We can't really get to them very easily now. The Blackwater Draw site is also not the oldest Clovis site anymore. There have been sites reported from South America that push the Clovis culture back to about 14,500 years ago. So this was the first site, and it's super, super important, but it is by no means the only Clovis site. Now, the people themselves seem to have lived in somewhat small, very mobile groups of nomadic hunters. They would travel place to place, chasing megafauna. This includes things like our Colombian mammoths, like was discovered at Blackwater Draw. The end of the Clovis culture kind of corresponds with the emergence of more regional groups of peoples in the Americas. There's a lot of speculation about why this was the case. This also corresponds with the megafauna dying out, probably in a large part because of climate change, but overhunting by Homo sapiens could have contributed as well. Regardless, maybe the disappearance of the megafauna led the inhabitants of North America, the human inhabitants, to realize that they needed to kind of change their lifestyle a little bit, and instead of roaming all over the place, they started to form more, not necessarily permanent settlements, but more regional territories. We see a proliferation in different styles of baskets and pottery, as well as spear points. We see that different groups are starting to develop maybe a little bit independently of one another. So it's very, very likely that the prevalence of megafauna in North America was the reason that the Clovis culture artifacts are so widespread. The Clovis people were expert tool makers. They used a wide variety of materials that they sourced from all over the place. And one of the interesting things about the Clovis culture is they would leave caches in different areas. These were basically bundles of projectile points and other tools that would be hidden at watering holes and hunting sites across the country that the groups would eventually circle back to. So they obviously had a very sophisticated understanding of animal migrations, seasons, and they had really figured out their migration patterns as they, went around hunting these animals. The Clovis point is the most famous of their tools, of course, and it's a very, very important artifact in the history of mankind. It's what we call a New World innovation, meaning that this point was developed independently of anything else that was going on with people groups around the world, right? Most people groups around the world were making things independently of each other, but this was in North America, so it's a New World innovation. The Clovis points were typically pretty big spearheads that were fluted in a very specific way. They were lanceolate, which means they were kind of elongated, and they were used primarily for bringing down big game. They could also be used as knives for dressing out the big game. The Clovis culture was known to make smaller stone knives, hide scrapers, needles out of bone, ivory. There's even been one bead found at Blackwater Draw. I actually saw it at the Blackwater Draw Museum. That is really, really interesting. We already talked about how we're not going to talk a whole lot about culture, but making ornamental jewelry has really interesting implications for the way that these ancient peoples thought. And it's kind of cool to just know that even 12,000 years ago, people were still thinking kind of like how we are today, you know? Hey, I want to look good today. Let me put on my nicest beads. I find that super interesting. I would also be remiss to not mention Anzac I in a video about the Clovis culture. We mentioned him a little bit again in my video about Sandia Cave, but Anzac I was a infant about 1 to 2 years old who was discovered in Montana back in the 60s and is the only known burial associated with the Clovis culture. This infant was buried with an assemblage of tools, 115 stone tools, including Clovis points, which is how we were able to link it to the Clovis culture. He was dated to about 12,500 years old, and his body was dusted with this red ochre. All of this indicates that he was buried deliberately and ceremonially. He was also the first ancient Native American to have their entire genome sequenced. This is what we talked about in my Sandia Cave video. The sequencing of this infant's genome supports the theory of an Asiatic origin of North America's native populations. There was a lot of drama around this find. He was discovered on private land, and because the remains were found on private land, the researchers didn't feel like they needed to get any clearance from native tribes in the area before they ran experimentation and excavated the body and stuff. Native tribes felt like that was a little bit of a violation, so the body was given back to native tribes in the area for reburial. But one of the other interesting things that came out of the genomic investigation into Anzac I was a linkage to native populations in Central and South America. So again, that just shows you how widespread the Clovis culture was. And again, it is super interesting that we have at least one ceremonial gravesite from the Clovis culture. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot about their belief system or anything, but it is really cool. It's very, very cool. And I wasn't going to mention it, but I decided I can't just make a video on Clovis culture and not mention Anzac I. So there we go. The Clovis point, first described and recognized from Blackwater Draw, is actually the oldest, most widely distributed artifact in North American history. The Clovis culture was incredibly successful and just super widespread. I think I've said that probably 3 or 4 times at this point. Editing Gideon, remember that. After Whiteman's discovery in 1929, it did not take that long for the wider archaeological community to recognize that there was something very, very important at Blackwater Draw. And so a lot of big names quickly became involved. This includes people from the Smithsonian and some of the highest respected archaeologists of the time. One of these guys was an anthropologist named Edgar Billings Howard, who left another excavation he was doing in the Guadalupe Mountains of Eddy County, about here. He left that site to go work on the Clovis site. He was working on the Burnett Cave in Guadalupe Mountains in 1929, and interestingly enough, that would actually turn out to be the first professionally excavated Clovis site. They just didn't really know it at the time. They did find a Clovis point there, but it wasn't until more research was done at Blackwater Draw that they realized kind of what they were dealing with there. At the time that Howard was working there, they were mostly digging through some relatively younger strata in the cave, and wasn't until a little bit later they started finding the Clovis stuff. But I find that to be kind of ironic and really, really funny in some ways. But Blackwater Draw proved to be super important because not only did it provide artifacts, it provided really good artifacts and evidence of humans hunting mammoths and mastodons. There have been a ton of bones taken out of this site. In fact, according to this little brochure that I picked up at Blackwater Draw, they found 28 mammoths at this draw over the last 80 years. That's pretty incredible. This is not a big area, but the just density of skeletal remains, tools, it's mind-boggling. But why? Why were there so many mammoths and camels and saber-toothed cats and dire wolves and bison? Why were they coming to this area where the people were obviously lying in ambush to hunt them and eat them? Well, it all has to do with the Brazos River. The Brazos River today is the 14th longest river in the United States, and it's pretty much entirely within Texas. However, its drainage basin extends up into New Mexico, and the headwaters of the river are in New Mexico, although it's very rarely flows above the subsurface. Where is that drainage basin? Where are those headwaters? Right there. In fact, the headwaters of the Brazos River is Blackwater Draw. See, back in prehistoric times, Blackwater Draw was an active natural spring. This would have been a lake that was very wet, had a lot of water, and it would have been full pretty much year-round, making it an excellent spot to go and find animals, especially if you're a hunter looking to eat some of those animals.
Okay, a couple things here. This is talking about some of the springs that would have fed the lake in this area. Talking about a tusk from a Columbian mammoth. Dr. George Agogino, remember him from our Sandia Man video? He was one of the archaeologists who I think he was the one that did the analysis of Hibbins' papers, and he found the inconsistencies in observations. Graded spring sands. Graded bedding is something interesting. I guess we could maybe talk about a little bit of that here. I have to get out and look at some of these beds a little more closely, but basically graded bedding means that you have a progression of energy flow environments. So the main idea behind it is that the more water flow you have, the more energy, the more sediment you can move, and the bigger sediments you can move. So you'll move, big pebbles, boulders, stuff like that. Then as your stream, river, whatever loses energy, the water flow decreases, you're moving less and less material, and you're forced to, or you can only move smaller bits. And so typically what you'll see in fluvial systems or even lake systems, basically what you'll see is big cobbles and gravel at the bottom, and then you'll see smaller pebbles and gravel on top of that, and then you'll see like sand and then mud and silt, and that basically just shows that your system is losing energy as it progresses. And then you'll see bigger stuff on top again, and the whole process repeats itself as your system gets more energy and then loses it again.
Very few sites are as important to the archaeology of North America as Blackwater Draw. Its importance cannot be understated. It completely revolutionized what we thought we knew about early paleo-indigenous cultures of the North Americas at the time. And even today, it continues to provide valuable artifacts, valuable research, valuable data about this very, very interesting and important group of humans from our past. There is so much to dig into here. One of these days, I'm going to have to make a video on the Folsom culture. Maybe I'll go out to Folsom, New Mexico, and make a video out there, because New Mexico is just a great state for archaeology, especially paleo archaeology. Like it's fantastic. There are so many amazing sites, and again, even though I'm not an archaeologist myself, I love these sites and the stories they tell, and I really, really appreciate all the work that a lot of people go into interpreting and preserving these sites to share their knowledge with the rest of us. There is so much to dig into at this site. Outside of the importance of the Clovis culture, We can talk about the megafauna of New Mexico, right? Geez, I should make maybe I need to make a video about the megafauna. We can talk about mammoths versus mastodons. We can talk about camels. We can talk about saber-toothed cats, and we can talk about ground sloths, and it'll just be a grand old time. Heck, we can talk about extinct horses, equiscotii, and animals like that. And maybe I will in the future, but I already know this video is going to be incredibly long, so I want to keep this as concise as possible and just have this be a video about the Llano Estacado and the Clovis culture that used to live there. I think that's where we're going to end it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Big shout out to my channel members right here at the Cowboy level. I appreciate everything they do for the channel. If you want to become a channel member and support me directly, there's a button down below. As for the rest of you hooligans, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe. I've been Gideon, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.